All right, it looks like the recording has started, so I think.
Okay. Perfect. Then we can go ahead and get started. Real quick, I'm just gonna try to adjust my screen. Welcome everyone. Yes, and if you need to enable closed captioning or anything like that, please feel free to do so while we're getting situated. All right. So, welcome everyone to Advocacy 101, which is an introduction to digital advocacy and sharing your story. Before we get into the meat of everything, my name is Kat Prue. I am an account manager at Beekeeper Group. I'm going to be leading the presentation today. Oh, and we have someone raised their hand. Yes, Chris, you have a question? I wonder if you can, are you able to put your question in chat or in the Q&A?
Yeah, go ahead and go forward. We'll have folks add their questions into Q&A, and then we'll address those as we get going.
Okay, sounds good. So we have, as you may have noticed, we currently don't have the chat function on, but we do have the Q&A feature on. So if you have any questions as we go forward, please put them into that Q&A feature. And we have some folks from the ALS Association team and the Beekeeper Group team to help answer questions as they come up. And yeah, so getting back into it, my name is Kat Prue. I'm an account manager at Beekeeper Group. I've been with Beekeeper for about 2 years, and I do advocacy work and communications work professionally. So I'm here to kind of help introduce advocacy work to you and share some of the basics of the advocacy process and creating digital advocacy messaging. But before we get into that, I want to first take a moment to just thank the sponsors of today's training. So we have our gold level sponsors here and our silver level sponsors. So thank you to those folks for making this training possible. And Vivian asked in the Q&A, what is Beekeeper Group? And I can elaborate a little bit more on that. Beekeeper Group is a public affairs firm based in Washington, D.C. So we help basically for our clients, help do strategic communications and advocacy work. So that could be working with a organization to help increase public awareness on a legislative or policy issue. It could also be working directly with lawmakers and helping to increase their awareness of the relevancy of an issue and why something's important, and driving them to hopefully take action to make progress on an issue or policy area. And yeah, and I'm going to keep going forward because I know I want to be respectful of all of your time today, but please put more questions in the Q&A tab as we go forward so that folks can answer them. So talking through what we're going to be going through today, we're going to be talking about digital advocacy. I know that many of you are likely a little bit newer to advocacy work. So by, flagging in the Q&A, if you want, you can let us know how you've participated in advocacy before, if you do have any experience. And participating in advocacy could include sending a letter to your lawmaker, tweeting at a lawmaker, even if it's just posting a video online for the general public. And it looks like that chat should be enabled now, so feel free to put this in chat as well. And just let us know what your experience has been so far. And with that, maybe what you are excited to do in advocacy as well as you get more experience. For those that have advocacy experience already, it might feel pretty familiar what we talk about, but our goal here is to help give more structure and to help pull back the curtain a little bit as to how important digital advocacy is within the advocacy landscape. And thanks for flagging that chat is disabled still. We'll take a look at it as we go on. So today we're going to talk about how creating impactful advocacy messages, what that looks like, how to do that. And along with talking about advocacy conceptually and why your participation in advocacy matters, we're going to talk through some tips for how to be an effective advocate, especially on a digital platform, and talk through what you can do. So we'll hopefully have time for questions at the end, but as I've mentioned, please put questions in the Q&A as we go on, and our helpers will respond over chat, and I can see if I can address as we go in between slides as well. So let's get started. So we have 3 main learning objectives today. Our first one is we're going to be talking about, we're going to learn how taking action online can have an impact for people living with ALS and their caregivers. The advocacy work that you do can have a major impact on lawmakers. And by sharing your experience about ALS with them, you are mobilizing policymakers to fund ALS research and consider the needs of those living with ALS and their caregivers. So that's our ACT portion today. And then we have message. We're going to learn about how to craft a good message, in particular, a good advocacy message, and how to share your story with a lawmaker in an impactful way. So personal stories are an incredibly powerful and an integral part of advocacy work. But it's not just about talking about yourself, talking about your experience. Usually there's a structure that you can use when sharing your story with a lawmaker that can help have the most impact. And finally, we're going to learn how lawmakers and their staff engage with constituents online. So how you can use social media to your advantage, and how to translate your story into a call to action. So you can share in the Q&A, and a couple have already shared about what they've done with advocacy so far, which is great. So you can tell us in the Q&A. Sorry, it says tell us in chat. Please tell us in the Q&A. Who do you advocate for? Are you advocating for yourself? Are you advocating for a loved one? Are you advocating for a neighbor or friend that you know has had an ALS journey? And let us know why you're here and kind of why this work is important to you. Yeah, great. So someone said, I advocate for my family, my dad, my uncle, my grandma, and others. And someone said that they're a first-time advocate, which is great to hear, and that they're advocating for their father, who was diagnosed in 2019. Someone said advocating for the next generation, which is really important as well. Yeah, thank you everyone for sharing. Advocating for their mom. Another person that mentioned advocating for their mom as well, or their dad too. Advocating for, in general, the ALS community. Yeah, that's great. Thank you everyone for sharing. And we'll continue to work on getting the chat enabled as well, so you all can see what everyone's sharing too. Someone said advocating for their wife. So really great to hear why you're here, and I hope that this session will be really helpful for all of you. So let's get into talking through an intro to policymaking and grassroots advocacy. So we're going to touch on a few different things. This is going to be pretty, the more information heavy part of our presentation today. But You can take your own notes if you would like to. There's no pressure to do that. We will share the slides as well as a study guide as resources, as well as a recording of the webinar as well. So no need to take your own notes. We'll have resources for you after this webinar. But we're going to talk a little bit about what is a bill, how a bill gets made, the appropriations process, which is a huge part of the ALS Association's advocacy work, what connecting with Congress looks like and how to start that connection, and turning stories into legislation. So let's talk through how a bill becomes a law. For many of you, if you remember Schoolhouse Rock from years ago, you might be familiar with the song I'm Just a Bill and remember some of that process, but I'm going to talk through it a little bit here as well. And I'm not going to sing it, unfortunately, for everyone, or fortunately, I should say. So what the main gist that you need to know is that a bill is a legislative proposal from a chamber of Congress, so either the House of Representatives or the Senate, and they can be drafted by a lawmaker, like a member of Congress or a senator, or they can be drafted by a regular citizen. But in order to be introduced, they need to have sponsors and ideally additional co-sponsors as well. And those sponsors and co-sponsors are the lawmakers in either the House or the Senate. So once a bill is introduced, it's assigned a bill number and is read. And if it's a House bill, for example, then it will be introduced by the Speaker of the House, and they will assign the bill to a committee that oversees the issues that the legislation addresses. So for example, one of those committees could be the Committee of Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, which is a committee in Congress. And once the bill reaches that committee, that bill is then referred to a specific subcommittee, which has additional expertise on that issue. And that subcommittee helps decide, they review the legislation, they edit it if needed, they do research on what's being covered in that legislation to help verify it, and then they move to approve, amend, defeat, or table the legislation. If it's approved, then it goes before the full committee and goes through essentially that same review process. And that full committee then moves to either amend it, approve it, defeat it, or table it. And so if it's approved then in that step, it then goes to the full chamber, meaning the full House floor, and the whole House has an opportunity to debate the bill and propose changes to be approved before the bill is fully voted on. So once the bill is voted on, and let's say that it passes, it then goes to the Senate to basically go through the same process, except the Senate version of the process, and then the Senate votes. And if both chambers, the House and the Senate, approve the legislation, it goes to the conference committee, which is made up of members of both the House and the Senate, who work out the differences between the two pieces of legislation. So I'm sure that you can imagine that between the House and the Senate, they may have different amendments, different edits to the bill, but what is passed is just one piece of legislation that is unified. So the conference committee helps basically rectify the differences between those two pieces of legislation, and then the unified piece of legislation is voted on again by both the House and the Senate. And if that passes, then it moves to the president to sign or veto. So I'm sure that might sound familiar, that the president can either signs the bill into law or can veto the piece of legislation. If they do choose to veto it, then it goes back to Congress, and Congress can override that veto with a 2/3 majority vote, which, depending on the congressional session, can be pretty difficult to do, and depending on the legislation as well. So when obviously this sounds like a very long and complicated process, and that's because it is. And this is just a simplified version of what this process looks like. So when you're engaging with your lawmaker, it helps to know where they are in the legislative process for the piece of legislation that you're talking to them about. Is this a brand new piece of legislation? Has it even been introduced yet? Is it being considered by a committee currently? Or does the bill need co-sponsors to move forward, and does it need more support before it's introduced? The ALS Association, generally when you're advocating on an issue for them, they will give you all the information that you need when participating in a meeting with a lawmaker, or even when just sharing your perspective on social media. And so you don't have to feel like that you need to have this huge expert knowledge of where a bill is in Congress in order to be an advocate, because we'll have resources for you. But it definitely does help to be able to have your own awareness of the process and how legislation gets made. So let's chat a little bit more about the appropriations process. So in either chat or in the Q&A, if the chat's still not working, I'd love to know how many of you are familiar with what the appropriations process is, if you know what it is and what it means. But for those that don't, I will go through it for you, so don't worry. So appropriations is essentially our federal government funding process, and it starts with the president submitting an annual budget to Congress for their consideration and approval, and that's usually in early February that happens. But it's not always the case that it's right on time, but usually the first week of February is the goal period for when the president introduces their budget. And the president's budget isn't really just a budget, it's an opportunity to introduce new programs or policies as well, a way to, present economic projections for the next year, to, say if there will be an estimated surplus or deficit based on the budget recommendations. But once it's sent to Congress, Congress then gets to work on a congressional budget resolution. Oh, perfect. And it looks like that chat is working, which is great. So everyone feel free to use that as well as we go forward. So the congressional budget resolution sets the total level of discretionary funding for the next fiscal year, or what is called 302A allocations, and they're supposed to be filed by April 15th. Of course, I'm sure you can guess that that also doesn't always happen exactly on time either. But once those recommendations the resolution is filed, it then moves into the Appropriations Committee, which is a really large committee in Congress. And that committee then breaks the resolution up for all of the appropriations subcommittees, which are especially specialized on the different facets of the different departments and initiatives that are funded by the federal government. So the subcommittees then get to work on reviewing the resolution and drafting their own appropriations bills that cover the federal programs that fall under their distinction. And that's called 302B allocations. And during this process, that is when a lot of advocacy for ALS research funding is happening. And that's when our advocacy efforts are generally the strongest during appropriations, because that's when we can have the most impact on getting additional allocations, funding allocations for ALS research. So once that subcommittee staff is done drafting that appropriations bill for their group of funding programs that they're looking at, they bring that bill up to the subcommittee for a vote. And if that passes, then that bill is taken up by the full Appropriations Committee. And often that is coming with several amendments to that bill. And once it passes through the committee, it's then moving on to Congress to be passed by Congress. And this process works in identical fashion in both the House and the Senate. And so I'm sure that you can imagine that both the House and the Senate will have two sometimes very drastically different appropriations bills that they're looking at and that they're drafting. This can mean millions and billions of dollars in difference between those bills. And so even when the chambers work from similar allocation levels, differences often occur between the total funding levels for many programs in each bill. So this is a very time-consuming and complicated process. And it's extremely important, though, because this is the budget for each fiscal year that we're setting for the federal government. And if we don't set that budget, then that's what can lead to a government shutdown as a possibility. So to help mitigate against a government shutdown, Congress usually passes what are called continuing resolutions, or CRs, to help maintain funding for government programs while the next budget is being deliberated. And recently, instead of passing multiple appropriations bills, because there's one for each subcommittee, they'll group all of these bills together into what's called an omnibus bill, which can be passed all at once. And so there's so much more that goes into the appropriations process because it is a very time-consuming, long process. But it also happens every year. And so it's extremely important to know a little bit about this process because it's extremely important for all of the federal departments and programs. So appropriations can have a huge impact on funding for research, healthcare benefits, as well as additional priorities that are of the ALS Association and for people that are living with ALS as well. So it's helpful to kind of have this context when you're going into an advocacy situation with the ALS Association or on your own. So let's talk a little bit more about connecting with Congress. So advocating to your lawmakers is essentially about persuading them to take action on a certain issue. So your personal experiences are already very persuasive because you're talking about what you're going through, what your ALS journey has been like. And that itself can be very powerful and impactful. But it also helps to know your lawmakers or whoever you're talking with, their position on the issues as well. ALS is not a partisan issue, but whoever you're talking with might not have a great understanding on the impact of the disease, what research looks like, etc. So when you're engaging with a lawmaker, consider if they have a personal connection to ALS, if they've been involved with any ALS legislation in the past, the committees that they serve on, or maybe if you have already met this lawmaker before and you already have a personal connection to them. Or also, maybe if they're a veteran, they might be connected to ALS in a different way. And along with that, are they an issue champion or supporter, meaning that they are very aware of the issues that you're talking about and they are with you and they agree with what you're saying. Or maybe they're an issue skeptic or undecided, meaning that they might have questions. They might not really have a great understanding of ALS and what it's like. And that's your opportunity to kind of talk with them and educate them on what the reality is for people that are living with ALS and their caregivers, right? And it can feel frustrating to talk with someone that doesn't understand your experience, but meeting them where they're at can help the conversation stay engaging and respectful and effective as well. And so how do you build a relationship? This can look like reaching out when you have something to say, as easy as that. Is there a specific piece of legislation that you'd like them to support or an issue that might be coming to committee soon? Sending them a tweet and saying, hey, I would really like to, tell you more about why this matters to me. And letting them know that you're a constituent as well. Your elected officials, even if you might personally not agree with some of their politics, or you might feel like that they probably don't agree with your politics, at the end of the day, you're their constituent and they're there to serve you and listen to you. And it definitely is important to think about quality over quantity. Make sure that you're providing value with them when you connect with them. So remember that congressional offices are really busy and they are working on a lot of issues at any given time. And so you want to be respectful of their time when you're engaging with them. And so being courteous and helpful can help do that. And when you're meeting with them, share your story, explain how this issue or legislation affects real people like you, and include some of your personal history so that they know what your journey has been like in dealing with this issue. And once you're done, it really helps to say thank you, especially if it's over social media where you're publicly tagging them and thanking them for meeting with you. They love to be able to show that, they have a relationship with their constituents and that they're appreciated. That looks great for them. But also, I think that it matters for those staff people as well that you're meeting with, that they know that you appreciate their time. So, turning stories into legislation. When a bill is gathering co-sponsors or is coming up for a vote, that is a crucial time for advocates to be communicating with lawmakers and sharing their perspective. And getting personal when connecting with a lawmaker increases the likelihood that they'll remember you and what the issue means to you. So for example, if you reach out asking your lawmaker to support a specific piece of legislation, your story helps give that piece of legislation a face, a name, and shows how it affects real people like you, their constituent. And that's especially important if the lawmaker is new to the issue or new to Congress as well. And for those that have put a couple of questions in chat, some of our helpers will answer them as we go along. Sorry, I flubbed my words there, or we'll answer them at the end as well. So let's talk about advocacy messaging, because it's one thing to want to be an advocate. It's another thing to know how to advocate, right? So let's talk about the components of a good message. It breaks down into audience, goals, context, structure, and language. And I know that this can feel very academic, but I promise it's actually very simple once you break it down. So your audience, that probably feels pretty obvious. Your audience is who you're talking to. So maybe that is a lawmaker, as I've mentioned. That's a very typical situation in advocacy, as you're talking with lawmakers. It might also be the general public. And think about, what's their experience? Do you know their connection to ALS if they have one? And I'm sure that the idea of talking about your personal experience may seem second nature, but in reality, talking with a lawmaker, it'll likely be a short interaction, or if it's online, crafting a digital message is just kind of a caption on a post, right? Or a short video. So you want to make sure that you're able to kind of break things down and plan ahead for whatever message you're going to say. So thinking through your audience and how you're communicating with them, and then your goal. Each message should have a goal. If you have a central message or ask, focus on that as you shape your story. So for example, if you're advocating for funding for ALS research, what has your experience been with treatment? And have you been a part of any ALS research trials? Think of context as the elements of your personal story that you feel are most important for hitting that persuasive element. Is there a specific moment you connect to that ties into the issue you're meeting with your lawmaker about? And can you talk about how the legislation would personally impact you, right? And do you have any data that can help back that up? And then structure is the framework for you when you're communicating. Think of it as introduction, education, persuasion, action. You want to introduce yourself and the issue you're talking about. You want to include all of the facts or pieces of information that will help bring them up to speed on the issue really quickly. Persuasion is the why. Why is this important? Why does it matter? And then that action element is what they can do in that moment to take action. And following that format not only will help you more easily organize your thoughts when going through this with a person, but it'll help create an impactful message for whoever's in your audience that's hearing you. And then finally, it helps to use intentional language. So we want to be clear, concise when we can be, and confident in what we're saying. And we also want to use strong language when we can. ALS is a terrible, heartbreaking disease, and we don't need to sugarcoat it. We don't want to sugarcoat it. We want to have an impact with whoever we're talking about and share with them why this issue is so important. And part of this is including a call to action. And so I want you guys to be thinking about, as I'm going through this slide, a call to action that you can use for, an issue that you're really passionate about, whether that's related to ALS or another issue. So we've talked about how to break down an advocacy message, but calls to action are kind of a separate part of that. They'll appear in your advocacy message, but they'll usually be that last part that's really supposed to hook people in and help them take action. So it's having a clear ask, so clear and action-oriented, developing a narrative arc. It sometimes helps to use, if we do X, Y can happen, or we get Y. Something that kind of shows the cause and effect of what your goal is. And being repetitive when you can. On social media, that might look like a hashtag that you can use. Or when talking, if there's any phrase that you can use that helps create that impact over time, over and over, to kind of bring people along with you and build the power of your message. And then social proof, showing that it's not just you. There is a community of people that are advocating for this issue. There's a community of people that are impacted by this issue. So what's a call to action that you can think of for, as an example, increasing funding for ALS research? Or in the chat, if you want to just include a call to action for any issue that makes sense to you, anything that comes off the top of your head, and just kind of start to flex that muscle, talking in that with that advocacy messaging in the back of your mind. Yeah, so Gloria said examples, act now to help, sign this petition. Yeah, and another easy way to think is, take action now to fund ALS research, or let's say, we need action now to help ALS caregivers. Kind of showing that, distilling your entire message down to kind of a short statement, so that way they can know what they can do in just like one sentence to help you achieve your goal. Yep, that's a great one, Gloria. Doug as well, support increased funding for the ALS registry. That's great. Yeah, some great options going through to the chat. I'm going to keep going through the slides, but feel free to keep putting them in there and chatting with each other as well. So let's talk about building good digital messaging. Digital messaging can feel and look different than talking with someone in person. You usually have less room. It might not have, a visual attached to it. It might just be text on a screen. So when you're creating digital messages, use your GPS. You want to grab attention immediately. You want to paint pictures and evoke emotions with your words, and you want to use strong language throughout. So you got to be a little bit quicker with your hook when you're framing your story, when you're adding context of your story. You can't necessarily include pages of context or what would be several minutes of dialogue, because you don't necessarily have that time. But by, thinking about your GPS, it can help you accomplish your message much quicker and easier for a digital platform. And this also can incorporate into a video as well. We're going to talk about sharing your story through video a little bit throughout the rest of this presentation as well. And keep in mind that digital messaging does not just have to be text on a screen. And it doesn't have to just be a caption on a social media post. It can also be a video or, a snippet on a podcast or something like that too. So keys to good digital messaging. Knowing your audience. This is similar to what we've talked about before. Even from social platform to social platform, your audience might be different. Your audience between Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter, there might be different groups of people that might be communicated with better in different ways. So thinking through who your audience is, and then when customizing your message, it's not just about using different platforms. Think about also how someone might best hear that message. Like, what's the best vehicle for sharing your message? So whether that is a video or an op-ed, for example, could be another way that you're customizing your message. And at the end of the day, always thinking to be true. So accurately representing your story and the stories of those that you advocate for. Like I said, you can use strong language. We want to use strong language when possible, but obviously you want to be genuine. You don't want to be, embellishing and or like adding facts that aren't necessarily true. You want this to be your genuine story and the stories of those that are in your community. Big part of digital messaging is visuals. So don't discount the impact of photos and videos, even if they're not directly related to your caption, even if they're just a photo of you with your family. They help create a visual identity for your message and help put a face to your words. So of course, if you're not interested in sharing photos, that is totally fine. The ALS Association will usually have graphics that they've created for different advocacy campaigns that they're doing, and you can share those graphics as well with your posts, and that is also great. 5, be consistent. Consistency can be consistency in your message, but it can also be consistency in how often you're communicating with your audience about an issue. So if you're regularly sharing about a certain issue on your social media, especially an advocacy issue, your networks will begin to see you as a resource on that topic and someone that knows what they're talking about. And that consistency also, over time, can build an impact. If you're communicating with someone just once about something, it might leave their mind if it's not one of their priorities. But if you continue to communicate with them, it'll stay in front of their mind that this is an important issue. And use your channel strategically. I'm sure that probably all of you might have at least one social media platform, if not more than one. So feel free to customize your message based on that platform. Think about, again, who the audience is on that platform and think about how to best shape your message. So, for example, on over email, if you're sending an email to your personal network, then you can have a little bit more room to add more messaging from like your personal story, more facts. But you also probably want someone to be clicking through to someone. So thinking about, how are you engaging and how are you motivating someone to click to donate or click to learn more. On LinkedIn, that's typically a professional platform. So you want to also be communicating with a professional network. Facebook is probably your personal network, your friends and your family. So what do they need to hear from you? What do they want to see from you in terms of an update? And what will be helpful for them to see and motivate them to take action as well? So those are just a few different examples of social platforms. But if you have any questions about other ones where you're not sure how to use it well, feel free to put that into the Q&A or into the chat too, or save your questions to the end as well. It's totally fine. And how do you increase engagement on social media? So I'm sure that all of you are familiar with the Ice Bucket Challenge, which now happened several years ago. But it's a great example of how an advocacy challenge can have a huge impact for an organization. So think about what kind of challenge that you could issue to your immediate network, what kind of hashtag you could use, and what you would encourage them to do. And you can put some ideas in chat if you want, if you have anything that comes to mind. But this is something that, as an advocate, it's not necessarily about just, sharing something that another organization made. You can also create your own initiative, write your own content, and that can be really great. Deirdre says, can we bring the Ice Bucket Challenge back? Potentially, we could. I'm sure that maybe people might be sick of the ice water, but who knows? Maybe if we made it like flavored, like the Kool-Aid challenge. That was just a joke. I'm not necessarily recommending that, but Susan has a great point. It's a great time to give in the heat. So for a few minutes, I want to go through the ALS Action Center, which many of you might have already navigated to in the past, and I hope that you all can still see the Action Center on my screen. So the ALS Action Center is where you as an advocate can easily take action by sending a letter to a lawmaker. It also is a place where you can learn more about the advocacy work that the ALS Association is doing. So the link to it is in these slides, and as I mentioned, the slides will be shared with you as well. But here you can become an ALS advocate. So it allows you to sign up if you want to get advocacy alerts in the future. Then you can sign up for the Action Center here. And then it also has opportunities to take action. So if you go to our current action alerts, there are different opportunities. There are phone opportunities if you would prefer to talk on the phone, if that's something that you feel comfortable doing. Opportunities to write to your lawmaker, and also to tweet as well. There are also story opportunities, which you see here. And there's our share your story form, which I'll show a little bit later in the presentation, where you can share a video story or a text story. And then also on the Action Center, there's just more information about policy priorities too. So we have a link to our federal policy priorities and state policy priorities. And then in the Take Action menu, you also see ways to give as well. If you're not sure who your elected official is, you can also find that information as well. So I encourage you to check out the Action Center if you haven't been there yet. Has anyone, oh, I went out of presenting. Sorry, folks, 1 second. Has anyone gone to the Action Center before and taken action on the Action Center? Gary says, I have. Wonderful. A bunch of people have. That's great to hear. So we've talked a lot about sharing your story. I'm sure that you've been like, what the heck? This person's saying that so much. But it really is impactful. So I wanted to share a couple of examples of folks, other ALS advocates that have shared their story. And these are not the full text of the stories that were shared with us from Joe and Bonnie, but they show a snippet of what it can be like to share your story and what that content looks like. And these were graphics that you may have seen on our on the ALS Association's social media as well, if they look familiar to you. So something to think about when you're reading through these, think about, the call to action, how they're framed. Both of these are kind of focused on how, why we advocate and what we need in order to continue to have a fighting chance and, eventually find a cure for ALS. So, and that's all context that's great to share in your personal story, because that's what a lawmaker generally, and even just a regular person that just doesn't know a lot about ALS, that's what they need to hear in order to be called to action. And then here, I'm just going to share a little bit of this video, just in the interest of time. But this is also on our website, and it's a video from an advocate named Dawn, and she's sharing her personal journey with ALS so far, and why ALS research is important. And please let me know if you cannot hear it. Okay, I can't hear it. So let me make sure that thanks, guys. One moment while I share sound. There we go.
Hi, my name is Dawn Tucker. I live in Pierce, Nebraska. In March of 2022, I was diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. And then by May 20th of 2022, I was in a trial for ALS. I did 22 weeks of that. And then the pharmaceutical company, they ran out of funds to continue the open label because it's very expensive to do research. So I stopped on April 6th because my symptoms go back to 2020. And to do research, they want you in early onset. And I am going to be approaching the 36 months. So I need to get into the next trial, which is Regimen F. Fingers crossed that I make it into that trial because I want to do anything and everything to help with research, because we have to find drugs to continue to slow down the progression of the disease, and maybe someday it will be a cure for it.
Sorry, folks, if the volume was a little low. As Dustin mentioned, we'll share the video, the link to this video as well, since it is available on our YouTube channel so that you all can watch it as well. But hopefully for those that could hear a little bit, essentially Dawn is talking about how she was in an ALS research trial, and then that company they ran out of funding, and so they had to stop the trial, and how that's really devastating because a lot of these research trials are, in some cases, a big hope for someone that is currently living with ALS and looking for treatment options. So, and then she talks about why it's important for funding for ALS research. And later in the video, she goes on to talk about how important it is also to her family as well. So it's a great example of sharing your story, and we'll have the link for you so that you can view it in full. And I also recommend the other stories that are on the ALS website as well, that also go into really great detail about why ALS has had a huge impact on their lives and what they care about. So in talking about the power of stories and how to frame your message when communicating with a lawmaker or another person, let's focus on you all putting together your own stories. So keep in mind that stories are not just for person-to-person communication. They can be shared widely on social media. You can write an op-ed, which is a longer form of story that would be shared in a newspaper or a website. You can share and speak at a town hall meeting, or share your perspective in a more like public forum like that. And in each of these opportunities, there's a way to make your story fit the medium or the venue that you're in. But at the core, it's the same. It's you sharing your personal perspective and why the issue is important to you. So this website here, als.org/share your ALS story. I'll load that up as well so that you can see. It is a link on the ALS Association website where you can share your own story, either through video, or you can also submit a written story as well. And these stories are then added to the story gallery page, which I will pull up. Here, which includes stories from other folks that have been impacted by ALS. And I really encourage you to do this, if only to kind of flex that advocacy muscle and kind of learn how to use the tools that we learned today to talk about your story. But I also think that reading these stories can be really helpful as well, especially if you are newer in your ALS journey or want to share with someone that might be struggling to understand what you or a loved one is going through. And next, the last piece of this is an elevator pitch. So how many of you have either heard of what an elevator pitch is or have done an elevator pitch in the past as well, even if it's outside of advocacy, just in your own line of work? Yep. Perfect. So a lot of you are familiar. So your elevator pitch is essentially, and the time frame can change, but within essentially 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, you want to accomplish who you are, what is the issue that's important to you, why is it important, and what should the audience do. So very similar to what, our framing of a good advocacy message and that call to action. It's a very similar thing, but your elevator pitch is really getting it down to a short amount of time. So think to yourself how you would write an elevator pitch for yourself. What would you include? If you want to, you can write out some sentences and include them in the chat, as we're also answering other questions. If you want to add that there too, you can. and would love to kind of just be able to read your own little elevator pitch about yourself, if you feel comfortable. But with that, we have some minutes for any questions from anyone in the audience. I don't see any open questions in the Q&A, but if you have any, please add them to the Q&A or the chat, and I would love to help answer them. Yeah, so Gloria says she would love to hear some elevator pitches. So if anyone wants to write them in the chat, then just a few sentences, then that would be great. And would you add the link to the stories on the ALS.org page? Yes, yeah, in the, when we share the slides, that link will be included in the slides for, oh, you mean the story gallery? Yes, I can include that link as well, along with Dawn's video link for you all so that you can see that too. And the slides will be made available. I believe that we're going to share a PDF of the slide deck with you. So you'll be able to kind of have that PDF version on your own. And we're going to be sharing a study guide that kind of goes along with the slides too. And then Randy asks, have we addressed any presidential candidates regarding our cause? And so maybe Dustin can speak about that a little bit more, since that's more directly related to the ALS Association's work. And then Callie says, I'm new to this and this is a lot of information. I would like a where to start guide. Yeah, so the study guide that we'll share after this webinar, I think will be really helpful. That will include, kind of encapsulate the details from the slides, but also hopefully give you a good starting point. And then Dustin, would you like to answer Randy's question?
Sure, I'll just come off mute just real quick. And Randy, we have not engaged yet, but we know that the 2024 process is upcoming, and so we'll look to see how we can engage in the future. So more to come on that, but I appreciate you raising that for us, and I'll definitely be taking it back to our folks here, so thank you.
Thanks, Dustin. And then John says, is there a place to find key statistics regarding ALS and funding that could be shared? Yeah, so on that Action Center, you can find in the links that are within the menu on that webpage, you can find more data regarding like state profile data for the different state impact of or the ALS impact in different states. And then on the policy and advocacy section of the ALS.org website in general, there's a lot of helpful information too that can be used. Dustin, do you want to add anything along to that?
Sure, I'm putting a link in the chat to where we can order there's some additional text.
Great. Awesome. And I also love, I've seen a couple of folks, Shelby put a great little elevator pitch in the chat, which is awesome. And Matt as well put a little bit of information. Really great to hear from you all. We have another question. In the past, we had our meetings arranged with our US rep and US senators. We were also joined by staff from our ALS chapter. Will this be happening this year? Yeah, there definitely will be fly-ins that happen periodically. Dustin will have more details on the exact dates of when those are happening and how they'll be organized. But we do similar events to like that still. Oh, Dustin, you want to add something?
One quick thing I'll say is that for August Action Month, we are having key meetings in backing districts with 42 appropriators who are working on ALS research. So if you tune in to our August 1st webinar, you'll learn more about that and how you can actually help participate. We're going to have actions for everyone to be able to do. So stay tuned for more information on that.
Yeah, and for those that have not been aware, August is going to be a huge advocacy month for the ALS Association. So there will be a lot of opportunities to take action yourself, as well as share information with your personal networks on how they can get involved as well. And then, do you know the process and how a lawmaker or their aide responds to a letter? Is there any benefit to a handwritten letter with a certified receipt? That is a great question. Generally, the staff of a lawmaker's office will respond to their all of the letters that they receive, even if they're maybe just like a form letter from a different website. They might not be a completely personal letter, because obviously a congressional office will receive a lot of different communications. But I will say a handwritten letter that's mailed to their office will be given likely a bit more care in reading and responding, because those are just kind of received differently. So I think especially also, as I mentioned, connecting with your congressperson, starting to develop a relationship with a lawmaker, a great way to do that is through letter correspondence, because you can kind of show that you're taking a lot of intentional care in writing to them and hoping for a response. And then I assume a number of state legislators have passed appropriation statutes beneficial to ALS patients. Can we get copies of the wording in some of those statutes? That's a great question. I think that Dustin might be able to answer that a little bit better than myself. So I'll let him respond.
We can, we're currently working and tallying up all of the great work that's going on in state legislatures. We have already surpassed the additional funding this year from last year. I think we've gotten 6 million more, and it's counting, so additional states are coming in. So as that all gets finalized, the state legislatures start to close, we'll be sharing that information with advocates. So also watch our social channels. We'll have some more information on that. So thank you so much for bringing it up. There's been a lot of great work in the state legislature.
Thanks, everyone. Anne did flag in the chat that Dustin, your audio is slightly muffled. So for everything that we've talked through, since this is also a recorded session, we'll make sure that the specific items that folks have asked about, we'll note them written out as well. So that way you all can have any of the links that you need. Like, for example, the ALS.org/August, I believe, is one of the links that Dustin shared in the chat as well. That will be helpful. And with that, we're basically right on time for 4 o'clock, and there's no more questions in the Q&A. Thank you all so much for your time today. I hope that this was a helpful presentation, and I look forward to seeing all of your advocacy work in the future and seeing what you do as a wonderful qualified advocate. So thank you for your time today, and please be in touch with the ALS Association Advocacy team if you have any additional questions. All right, have a wonderful rest of your day.